The process and product of education have always been under academic and intellectual scrutiny, mainly because of the importance of the outcome of education for socio-economic development, and also because of the significant amount of investment in terms of time and resources that go into the process of education. So there is always an interest regarding the ultimate outcome or results of the process of education. Now, an interesting concept is the outcome-based education. What is outcome-based education? Why do we need to have outcome-based education, and what is the general process of outcome-based education? These are the questions that we will respond to in this presentation. So first, outcome-based education, what it is. Outcome-based education is basically a philosophy and a system of education which has an emphasis on the outcomes or results of an educational process or program. So the focus of outcome-based education is on the question of the what of the process of education. So what students can or will do at the end of the educational process. And so the focus is on the ability, the outcomes in terms of the ability of students to do things rather than what they know or think or feel. In other words, the outcome-based education has its focus on a more practical skills and abilities that students can and should develop as a result of the process of education. There are some questions that we need to ask in order to clarify the concept of outcome-based education or meaningful education. So the first one is, what is being taught in educational institutions? Secondly, what is the rationale behind the aims, processes, and product of education? Thirdly, what do we get at the end of the educational process? These are important questions that we need to respond to in order to understand the concept of outcome-based education. And lastly, does the ultimate outcome of the educational process justify the process of education? So generally the outcome of the educational process is in the form of the students or the graduates. And so are we getting the kind of graduates as a result of the educational process that we need in our that we need in line with our socio-economic requirements? And so the outcome-based, the what of the outcome-based education can also be explained in terms of the learning outcomes on the part of students. And so what is the criteria of the outcome-based education? The criteria basically is the learning outcomes rather than the process of education. The focus is basically on clearly defining and outlining of the educational outcomes and the designing of an educational process that results in students' achievement of those outcomes or standards. Again, the emphasis is on the what and whether rather than the when and how of the educational process. And this actually means what the students are learning and whether the students are learning what they should learn as a result of the educational process. The when and how questions are not the central questions, and by this what is actually meant is when students should learn and how students should learn are secondary considerations in this type of in this philosophy of education. So some students might learn earlier than others might take more time. Similarly, some students might learn in one way or through one method, the others might learn in other ways. And that actually means that time and the methodology of teaching are less important in comparison to the kind of learning that students are having and whether students are actually learning or not. Some of the pioneers of the philosophy behind the outcome-based education include Ralph Taylor, Benjamin Bloom, and William Spady. Now, the why of it, why is it important that we should have outcome-based education? Well, there are several reasons that make the rationale behind the concept of outcome-based education. The first one is that outcome-based education gives us clarity regarding educational outcome. So right at the outset or at the beginning of the educational process, we need to be clear about the outcomes or the ultimate ends of the educational process. So those are the ends in the light of which we plan the process of education and towards which we actually lead the whole educational process. So the premium in the outcome-based education is on the ends rather than the means. So the means can vary, but the ends are important. And that is why, because this type of education helps us in achieving the ends and focusing on the ends or the ultimate aims of education. So that is why this is an important philosophy of education. Then the rationalization of the educational process in the light of achieving the product or outcomes. So generally, in many traditional education systems, the educational process becomes an end in itself. But in the outcome-based education system, what happens is that the rationalization of the educational process comes from the fact that that process actually leads to certain clear outcomes in terms of its objectives and in terms of the knowledge and the skills that students get to. Then the other important thing because of which this educational philosophy is an important one is that it brings in flexibility in terms of time, resources, teaching methods, and individual student progress. So generally, the traditional education systems are less flexible. There are set timetables and there are set procedures and resources, and then there are certain set teaching methodologies. And again, every students need to go along other students. And so there is a kind of competition sometimes among unequals. And this type of the outcome-based education, on the other hand, brings in the kind of flexibility that makes the process of education more productive and more realistic. Then creativity and imagination. Because the focus is on individual students' progress, and the focus is on basically the achievement of aims rather than the means. As a result, there is chances for more creativity and imagination in terms of getting to the point of achieving the educational outcomes. Democratization of the educational process, again, because this type of education gives more space both to individual students and to schools and to teachers in terms of coming up with ideas that can lead to the outcomes that are set in the beginning of the educational process. So it brings in more democratization It's not a top-down structure. Inclusion of the less of the students with the different abilities and with different skills or with multiple intelligences is all of this type of education. Then more autonomy for students, teachers, and educational institutions is another reason because of which this type of education is important. Better academic achievement is, research has also shown that outcome-based education has often led to better academic achievement among students. Now, outcome-based education, the how of it. Based on Speddie's 1994 model, there is a general process of the outcome-based education. And so the outcome-based education begins with the process of defining the outcomes of the educational process at the very outset of the educational process. Then in the light of those outcomes or ultimate results or what we want to achieve towards the end of the educational process, the curriculum is designed in line with those outcomes. Then that curriculum is delivered through instructions or teaching, and then the next one is that the results and outcomes are documented, and finally it is determined whether students have made progress in terms of achieving outcomes or goals. So this is the general process or the how of the outcome-based educational process. Lastly, there are certain principles of the outcome-based education system, and so those principles include the principles of clarity of focus, because the outcomes or the intended results are set in the very beginning. That actually gives clarity to the educators and to the students and also to the educational administration in terms of where they are going. So that actually gives clarity of focus. Secondly, expanded opportunities, because there is flexibility in terms of the kind of opportunities the students get in terms of time, in terms of resources, in terms of the ways that they learn. So that actually leads to expanded opportunities of learning for students. And so this is the other very important and useful principle on which the outcome-based education is based. High expectations. Generally, because students come up with different abilities, different skills, different learning styles, and because there is this flexibility in the outcome-based education in terms of the opportunities the students get in order to learn and progress. As a result, students are expected to actually have high achievement, academic achievement, and so there are high expectations. And so every student is expected to get to the highest standards that are set in terms of the outcomes of education. And lastly, design down. This actually means that this type of education system begins at the level of the outcomes or the intended results. And so that is why this is designed down towards then deciding the process of the education, and so that process then ultimately results or leads to the outcomes that are actually expected. So we can say that this is a design down principle that is used that is applied in the outcome-based education. So here are some references and suggested readings that you can refer to for further understanding the concept of outcome-based education.